The ink on my divorce papers wasn't even dry when my multimillionaire father-in-law blocked the courthouse exit, screaming that I was a penniless nobody who had never set foot in his family mansion again. He thought his high-priced attorneys had successfully stripped me of everything, completely blind to the strategic financial trap I had spent 3 silent years setting right beneath his feet. I simply adjusted my trench coat, smiled, and handed in my smartphone, displaying the immediate foreclosure eviction on his ancestral estate, alongside the termination papers for his golden child daughter. In less than 60 seconds, his arrogant smirk dissolved into sheer, unadulterated terror as he realized the quiet, underestimated housewife he tried to destroy now owned his entire corporate empire. My name is Sage Briggs. To understand how a woman who was systematically treated like invisible background noise managed to completely dismantle a multi-generational corporate dynasty in the span of a single morning, you have to look at the rotten, appearance-driven foundation of the Sterling family. For the 3 years I was married to Vance Sterling, I was treated as a low-status interloper in their wealthy enclave of Verdant Hills. The Sterlings were viewed as corporate royalty in our city, built entirely on the historical prestige of Valerius Luxury Group, a high-end international fashion and lifestyle conglomerate. My former father-in-law, Harrison Sterling, ran the family like an absolute feudal kingdom, demanding unquestioned obedience from everyone around him to mask a terrifying reality. The company's core financials were decaying rapidly beneath a massive mountain of unhedged operational debt. My former husband, Vance, was a deeply insecure, weak-willed man who spent his days masquerading as a high-powered corporate vice president, while his older sister, Tinsley, was the celebrated, untouchable CEO, a woman whose entire public persona as a brilliant business prodigy was completely manufactured by expensive public relations firms. When Vance first introduced me to his parents, my background as a self-taught quantitative data analyst and private corporate structures expert was met with open mockery. Because I didn't possess a legacy family name, a trust fund, or deep connections within the local country club networks, Harrison treated me with a condescending pity, while my mother-in-law and sister-in-law systematically excluded me from every meaningful family function. They would force me to sit at the far end of the table during major corporate dinners, openly referring to me as Vance's little charity case to their wealthy associates. They genuinely believed I was a naive, submissive girl who would look the other way out of gratitude for being allowed into their elite circle. They thought I would remain completely blind while they quietly utilized my late grandfather's modest commercial real estate holdings to bolster their own failing credit lines. For 3 years, I kept my head down, tolerated their calculated emotional slights, observed their daily operations, and took meticulous notes on the shocking level of financial malpractice, systemic tax avoidance, and fraudulent asset inflation that Tinsley was using to keep Valerius Luxury Group afloat on the global market. The absolute breaking point of our marriage arrived 6 months ago, when I discovered that Vance was engaged in a highly public, humiliating affair with a shallow, 20-something lifestyle influencer named Bianca. Rather than showing a single shred of remorse or basic human decency, the Sterling family rallied entirely behind Vance's betrayal to protect their public image. My sister-in-law, Tinsley, actively helped Vance conceal his infidelities, utilizing corporate credit lines to fund luxury European vacations for Vance and his mistress under the fraudulent guise of market research trips. When I finally confronted Vance with the hard, digital evidence of his behavior, he didn't even bother to deny it. Instead, he laughed directly in my face threw a copy of our ironclad, family-drafted prenuptial agreement across the kitchen island and coldly informed me that if I attempted to expose him, his father's legal team would ensure I left the marriage completely destitute, and blacklisted from every professional firm in the state. What the Sterling family did not realize was that their profound, lifelong arrogance had blinded them to the ultimate financial reality of the modern corporate world. They viewed me as a broke, helpless housewife, completely unaware that during my long nights in our guest bedroom, I had quietly built an independent, multi-million-dollar financial empire, operating entirely under the anonymous corporate umbrella of Meridian Apex, a private, ultra-secure, sovereign acquisition fund backed by elite international institutional investors. I had been quietly monitoring the rapid systemic decline of Valerius Luxury Group. Tinsley's aggressive, vanity-driven expansion plans into volatile foreign markets had left the conglomerate dangerously leveraged, relying on a series of high-interest, short-term corporate debt packages to maintain the false illusion of profitability for their shareholders. Through Meridian Apex, I spent 5 months quietly purchasing over 42% of those distressed corporate debt packages from secondary international lenders, slowly wrapping an invisible financial noose around the family's neck. Every time Tinsley appeared on a luxury business podcast boasting about her visionary leadership, my legal teams were quietly absorbing another heavy layer of their operational liabilities. But the true crown jewel of my strategic retaliation was centered on their beloved family crown, the Obsidian Estate, the massive, sprawling $30 million ancestral mansion in Verdant Hills that Harrison used as the ultimate symbol of his family's structural dominance. To fund Tinsley's failing winter apparel launch, Harrison had quietly placed the deed of the mansion into a specialized corporate holding structure, using the property as collateral for an emergency liquidity loan. When that product launch catastrophically failed due to Tinsley's gross incompetence, the holding structure fell into an immediate technical default. My private acquisition fund moved with an absolute freezing speed, quietly buying out the underlying mortgage default from the regional banking cartel and taking total ownership of the deed 48 hours before the divorce hearing began. By the time I sat down at the defense table in the family court pavilion, my real estate division had already finalized a binding multi-million-dollar sale of the land to a commercial development syndicate that intended to completely bulldoze the mansion to construct a high-density luxury medical plaza. As Harrison stood in the courthouse corridor, his face vibrating with a smug satisfaction, he was completely oblivious to the fact that his entire empire had just been hollowed out from the inside. I stood there, watching the digital clock on my watch tick to exactly 12:05 p.m., which was the precise moment my executive legal team entered the Valerius Luxury Group headquarters downtown. Suddenly, the sharp, piercing ring of Harrison's smartphone shattered the silence of the hallway. He frowned, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the device, his eyebrows knitting together as he saw his daughter Tinsley's name flashing on the screen. He pressed the button, holding the phone to his ear with an annoyed huff, loudly telling her that he was at the courthouse with Vance and they had just finished kicking me out of the family. Harrison's voice abruptly died in his throat, as Tinsley's hysterical, unhinged screams echoed so loudly through the speaker that every lawyer and bailiff in the immediate vicinity could hear her panic. She shrieked that the board of directors had just held an emergency, unannounced restructuring meeting because an institutional fund called Meridian Apex had bought out the majority voting shares and declared a hostile takeover. She sobbed violently, explaining that she had just been served with immediate termination papers for gross financial negligence and corporate fraud, and that security guards were standing inside her office, putting her entire career into cardboard boxes. When she screams that the legal team identified Sage Briggs as the sole managing partner of Meridian Apex, Harrison's phone slipped slightly from his grip, his face draining of every single drop of color until his skin turned a horrific, pasty shade of gray. He turned his head slowly, his eyes wide with an absolute suffocating terror as he looked at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. At that exact moment, Vance walked out of the courtroom, adjusting his tie with a confident, mocking smirk on his lips, completely unaware of the nuclear explosion that had just leveled his family's existence. Vance sneered, telling his father they should go celebrate at the club because they were officially done with me. But Harrison didn't move a single inch. He grabbed his son's arm with a violent, trembling grip, his voice a ragged, terrified whisper as he held the speakerphone up between them and told him that I had bought the company and fired Tinsley. Before Vance could even begin to process his father's words, a second alert flashed across Harrison's screen. An automated, high-priority email notification from the Oak Ridge Property Management Trust. Harrison forced his shaking fingers to open the message, his eyes scanning the official legal notice of immediate eviction, accompanied by a satellite map of the Obsidian estate, highlighted with a large red stamp indicating that the property had been acquired for commercial demolition, requiring them to completely vacate within 48 hours. Vance's arrogant expression shattered into absolute horror as he read over his father's shoulder, his breath catching in his throat as he turned to face me, his entire body shaking with a sudden, violent realization of his own ruin. He began stammering in a panic, waving his hands desperately as he protested that this was impossible, pointing out that our prenuptial agreement was supposed to protect their family assets. He pleaded with me, begging me not to let them bulldoze his ancestral home, desperately promising that he would break things off with his mistress that very day if we could just talk about the divorce terms again. I took a single step closer to my former husband and his father, my expression completely frozen, my voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp register that pinned them both to the spot. I told them that they had built their entire lives on the pathetic assumption that they could abuse, humiliate, and exploit people who didn't possess their unearned privilege, completely blind to the fact that I never wanted a single dollar of their decaying personal wealth. I told them that I wanted their institutional infrastructure, the debt lines their daughter fraudulently manipulated, and the deed to the mansion they used to look down on the rest of the world from. I informed them that Tinsley was currently being escorted out of her office by the very security team Harrison hired, and by Friday morning, a fleet of industrial excavators would reduce their ancestral home to a pile of worthless gravel. I turned on my heel and walked down the grand marble staircase of the pavilion, the rhythmic, confident click of my heels echoing through the high ceilings as my elite legal team formed a protective, imposing wall around me. The financial liquidation of the Sterling family was swift, absolute, and beautifully systematic. Within 48 hours, the news of Tinsley's high-profile corporate termination and the active forensic audit launched by Meridian Apex leaked to the global financial media, causing the remaining valuation of the Sterling family trusts to completely implode. The regional banking network moved instantly to freeze Harrison's personal credit lines and seize his remaining secondary assets to satisfy the massive default penalties incurred by his daughter's corporate fraud. Left completely broke and stripped of every ounce of their artificial high society standing, the Sterling family became immediate social pariahs in the very city they had spent decades trying to control. Vance's shallow influencer mistress Bianca vanished within 3 hours of the news breaking, taking his remaining luxury watches and sports cars with her, before blocking his number entirely. Forced out of the Obsidian estate by our immediate demolition crews, Harrison, Eleanor, Vance, and Tinsley were compelled to pack their belongings into ordinary cardboard boxes under the cold, indifferent gaze of the local news cameras. They were forced to move into a cramped, noisy 2-bedroom rental apartment situated directly above a diesel repair shop on the far industrial edge of the city. Their days spent managing a mountain of civil lawsuits and bankruptcy filings, while their frantic, weeping letters begging for a corporate settlement were systematically shredded by our security department. Meanwhile, back in our beautiful, thriving world, The sun shone with a radiant clarity over the new headquarters of Meridian Apex. Free from the suffocating, toxic atmosphere of a family that evaluated human life through the lens of superficial status, I redirected the entire operational framework of the Valerius Luxury Group, transforming the company into an ethical, highly profitable powerhouse that focused on sustainable technology investments and premium corporate opportunities for young, independent women from underprivileged backgrounds. Surrounded by a brilliant executive board, high-integrity legal professionals, and a community built on absolute merit and respect, I walked forward into a future of magnificent abundance and global influence, completely unburdened by the shadows of the past, reigning supreme as the sole, absolute master of my own destiny. The structural collapse of the Sterling dynasty provides a powerful lesson in systemic vulnerability and behavioral blindness. When a dominant group operates with absolute arrogance, they naturally stop analyzing their environment, assuming that their historical privilege makes them completely immune to market corrections. They mistake a person's silence, patience, and lack of overt hostility for compliance and weakness, entirely failing to realize that an analytical mind is quietly mapping their structural flaws. True leverage is never built on flashing your wealth or screaming your authority in hallways. It is constructed by quietly acquiring the underlying liabilities of your adversaries until you hold the absolute power to dictate the terms of their survival. Arrogance creates a profound operational blindness, and those who spend their lives trying to trap others with predatory contracts will eventually find themselves completely crushed by the superior geometry of a silent, well-executed strategy. When you find yourself embedded in a toxic environment where people systematically devalue your intellect, mock your background, and use legal or financial instruments to assert dominance over your life, you must immediately stop seeking their validation. Do not waste a single ounce of your valuable cognitive energy arguing with their conceit, weeping over their betrayal, or attempting to appeal to a corporate conscience they do not possess. True emotional and strategic self-reliance means operating completely outside their field of vision, observing their financial vulnerabilities in silence, and constructing a sovereign empire that possesses real, institutional power. Establish an ironclad, impenetrable barrier of legal and financial boundaries that completely insulates your peace from their malice. When the inevitable consequences of their own blindness finally bring your tormentors to their knees, do not offer them a single drop of mercy or a second chance to compromise your dignity. Let the silent, unyielding success of your beautiful new world be their final, definitive judgment. Keep your eyes fixed firmly on the light of your achievements, and never look back at the darkness you left behind.